Statements on the first anniversary of the signature of the Istanbul Convention. State of play in this regard. Please let me say that at 10 o'clock we've got to conclude this item on the agenda. Please bear that in mind, because at 10 o'clock we have the debate with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and that's a traditional event. Prime Minister of the Netherlands will be here at 10 o'clock, so I would like you to confine yourselves to your speaking times. I shall be quite strict on that, and I would wish also to say that when it comes to catch the eye session, there won't be any concessions there, and there won't be any concessions for blue cards either. So we'll hear now the Commission statement on the Istanbul Convention, and then the political groups, with a total of 45 minutes available. 5 minutes for the introduction and then 10 minutes for catch the eye. That's all there is. Please accept this arrangement today, because as I say, we have to have finished with the Istanbul Convention by 10 o'clock. So if that's acceptable, I see no one is speaking against, so it seems to be agreed. And I'll give the floor to the Council. Mrs. Monika Paniatova, you have the floor.
Thank you, President, honourable members, dear Vice President of the European Commission. Thank you for having this important debate on the agenda today. Indeed, this is not the first time I have the opportunity to discuss with you this very important topic. And I would like to use the opportunity to reiterate the points which I have made previously. Combating all forms of violence against women and young girls is a core element of the respect for fundamental rights. These crimes have no place in the Union, and the Council is clear on zero tolerance of violence against women. The Istanbul Convention is a comprehensive framework against violence against women and domestic violence. I apologize for the mistake. It constitutes a concrete tool to eradicate all forms of violence against women, protect its victims and prosecute the perpetrators. Finally, it contributes to the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women and promotes equality between women and men. All 28 member states have already signed this convention, and 18 of them have already ratified. The Council has on several occasions encouraged those member states that have not done so yet to ratify the Istanbul Convention. On 11 May 2017, the Council adopted the decisions on the signing of the Convention on behalf of the European Union. Our Presidency is carrying on the work on the conclusion of this important instrument. This includes reaching agreement on internal rules in the form of a code of conduct for the implementation of the Convention. According to the EU-wide survey on violence against women conducted by the Fundamental Rights Agency in 2014, 1 in 3 women, which means 33%, has experienced physical and/or sexual violence since the age of 15. 1 in 5 women, which means 18%, has experienced stalking. Every second woman has been confronted with one or more forms of sexual harassment. Violence against women cannot be seen as a marginal issue that touches only on some women's lives. Last but not least, gender-based violence also has a significant impact on economies and societies as a whole, for example, in terms of health, legal and social services. In 2014, the European Institute for Gender Equality has estimated that the cost of violence against women in the European Union could amount to billions. If I should be more precise, 109 billion per year. As President Tajani strongly affirmed, the struggle for the elimination of violence against women is a fight that each and every one of us must take part in. It's our duty to stand up for women by drawing awareness for this injustice. The Council has repeatedly expressed its commitment to preventing and eliminating all forms of gender-based violence. We all know that only our joint efforts and message of unity will help to improve the situation of all women and girls in Europe. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję pani Monice Panayotowej. A teraz bardzo proszę o zabranie głosu.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Panayotova. I'll now give the floor to the first Vice President of the Commission, Mr. Frans Timmermans. Go ahead, sir. I could also mention that you're one of the very few men who will be speaking this morning.
Members, 1 year ago, the European Union signed the Istanbul Convention, and since then we've seen women's marches and the Me Too campaign confirm once again that violence against women is a global issue that continues to affect women and girls in every part of the world. And we know that this violence is part of an effort to keep women in their place as lesser citizens, and this is unacceptable. The Convention is the first legally binding international instrument with enforceable provisions to prevent and combat violence against women. The Commission's intention is to conclude EU accession as soon as possible. Since the signature, we've been working intensively with the Member States and the Council to reach an agreement on a code of conduct that sets out the practical arrangements for implementing the Convention. The code should accompany the Council's conclusion decision and describe the division of roles between the EU and the Member States in implementing the Convention. We've been discussing legal competence issues as well as issues such as reporting and sharing information. Some Member States, regretfully, are still reluctant to support EU accession to the Convention. Let me reiterate again that the EU will accede alongside the Member States and will not replace Member States. Substantial aspects of the Convention, such as those related to substantive criminal law, remain under Member States' exclusive competence. However, the advantage is that if the EU becomes a contracting party in its own name, alongside the Member States, certain obligations set out in the Convention will be legally binding for the EU's institutions, bodies and agencies, and will therefore protect their staff. For example, the Convention requires that staff are protected through internal rules of the institutions to prohibit violence and harassment in the workplace and provide for procedures and services to support victims and to sanction offenders. The Commission is currently in the process of analysing the relevant obligations in the Convention, of screening the existing internal rules, regulations and practices of all EU institutions, agencies and bodies, and of determining whether there are any gaps in the current system. This is a task which will require full engagement of all European institutions and bodies, and I warmly welcome the European Parliament's cooperation in this regard. Unfortunately, achieving EU compliance with these international standards is not enough. Despite the fact that all EU Member States have signed the Convention and that 19 Member States have so far ratified it, we see strong opposition against the Convention in a few countries. A lot has been said about this Convention, some of which is frankly untrue. I would like to be very clear. This Convention is about protecting women against violence, nothing more, nothing less. 1 in 3 women in Europe has experienced violence at least once in her life, simply because she's a woman. And 1 in 3 women in Europe has experienced either physical and/or sexual violence. This is unacceptable. The Istanbul Convention is the first binding and comprehensive international instrument in Europe that addresses violence against women. It is not about imposing new social standards, it's about banning violence. The misconceptions and misleading arguments voiced in public debates about the Convention need to be confronted. The Commission is working on a communication strategy to rebut fears that the Convention would challenge conventional family or religious norms or introduce an obligation to allow same-sex marriage or a new refugee status for transgender or intersex persons. And I would really like to know in which universe social conventions or religious norms would allow for violence against women. Which religion does that? Gender equality is not a quick fix. We all know that. But unless we take concrete steps and move ahead together on this, we won't achieve the behaviour and cultural shifts that allow change. And I say this, I'm a son, I'm a husband, I'm a father of 2 girls. I find it completely unacceptable that my mother, my wife, or my kids, my girls, would not be better protected against violence. This is a duty shared by men and women. It's not only up to women to make this happen. And this is a duty we should all take very seriously indeed. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo panu Timmermansowi.
Thank you, Mr. Timmermans. We will now hear speakers from political groups on behalf of the EPP. Anna Maria Corazza-Bildt has the floor.
Signature of the EU of the Istanbul Convention was an historic step to strengthen our tools to prevent violence, combat impunity and protect victims. Since then, Estonia, Cyprus, Germany and now Croatia have ratified the Convention, but 10 member states are missing, including the presidency. I'm asking them, how many women have to be harassed, beaten up and killed? How many girls have been married away, mutilated or trafficked for prostitution before they ratify and enforce? All women and girls should feel free and safe in Europe, and no tradition and culture can justify men's violence against women. The EU accession to the Convention strengthens accountability for member states and the external action of the EU in promoting women's rights globally. It is about building a culture of respect for women and girls involving men and boys. The Convention not only provides for sanctions, training, support for victims, but also measures to combat stereotypes and sexism. So together today, let's call on the Presidency to put the Istanbul Convention on the agenda of the European Council as long as it takes, on all countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, Ukraine, to engage with civil society, with religious leaders, cross political parties, based on facts. And thank you, Vice President, for what you said, and on the Commission to concretely open a dialogue on the misleading interpretation of the gender interpretation in the Convention. The Convention is not against family. Mr. President, I'm finishing. It is violence that is against families. And as co-rapporteur of the Istanbul Convention, I will remain committed to zero tolerance to any violence against women and girls. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Serdeczna prośba. Trzymajmy się.
Thank you very much. Now, one thing I must say, you can stick to your speaking times. We don't have enough time. We can't have people going beyond their speaking time. On behalf of the S&D, now, Mrs. Revaud-Dallon-Bonnefoy, you have the floor.
Nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui pour célébrer.
President, we're here today to celebrate an anniversary, Istanbul, a year ago to the day. And it's a real anniversary. We congratulate each other. We look in the rearview mirror. We say, well, yes, women are better protected because Istanbul is a binding treaty, binding convention, best way to prevent violence and track down perpetrators and protect victims. But it's not a celebration. After a year of negotiations, the Commission and Council, no real progress has been made. Now, you might think that the negotiations have been advancing and that there's goodwill all around, and I do applaud that, but we need unanimity. Poland, Hungary, to name but two, are turning their face against this. Half the population might well end up as a victim, and they're not being given the right to live in a world without violence affecting them. And a draft law was withdrawn because of their own country. And it's not surprising that we're not seeing forward movement at European level. The EU must adhere to the convention. It's tunnel-visioned. The Parliament tried to broaden the focus. These are regrettable restrictions, and our own legal service has turned these down. So stop resisting something which can really bring help to women in Europe and crack down on impunity for those responsible. The culprits, we must quickly sign up to the convention and the 10 member states which have not done so nationally. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani Christine.
Thank you, Mrs. Christine Revaud. Now, on behalf of the ECR group, Mrs. Stevens has the floor.
Thank you, President, colleagues. Today, I want to make a fiery plea for ratification of the Istanbul Convention, because this is something which protects women against violence. It's very important. And we see female genital mutilation, forced abortions, forced sterilizations, child marriages, rape and honour murder. Religious beliefs must not be put up against the rights of women to be protected. Yes, there are cultures, customs, religion, traditions and so-called honour, but that must not be a pretext. And let me ask everyone, what is honourable about violence against women? And how can it be that combating violence is the opposite of defending traditional values? I think the EU must send out a strong signal against violence against women and all genders. Doesn't belong, has no place in our European society. And we talk about European values, but this is a flagrant form of discrimination. We must condemn that. And I think this is unworthy of the European Union. Thank you very much.
Bardzo dziękuję, pani Stevens.
Thank you, Mrs. Stevens. Now, for the ALDE group, Mrs. Molina has the floor.
Dear Commissioner, all around the world, in every country, women and girls still struggle to exercise their full human rights. Violence against women and girls is perhaps the most obvious manifestation of the deep imbalances in power in our societies and the vulnerabilities and limitations that follow them, especially for the most marginalised groups, when vulnerabilities are at their peak and protections at their lowest point. This year marks the first anniversary of the signing by the European Union of the Istanbul Convention, and it is an opportunity for us to reflect on the steps that have been taken so far, but it is also a possibility for a wake-up call. Only robust action can ensure women a life free from violence. I welcome the steps that have been taken in the negotiations of the Code of Conduct, which lays down the rights and obligations of the EU and the Member States under the Convention. This gives me the opportunity to call on the next EU Council presidency, Austria, my country, to conclude the Code of Conduct and to find a political agreement with the remaining problematic Member States who keep blocking the ratification by the European Union of the Istanbul Convention. For those Member States, I have a crystal clear message. I urge you to stop spreading outrageous misinformation about the Convention and its content. Gender is not a threat. Domestic violence is. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. W imieniu grupy.
Thank you. Mrs. Terry-Rienke has the floor.
15th of June will go down in history. It will go down in history as the day where the European Union truly stood up against violence against women and for the protection of women against violence. And fighting against violence should actually not even be a debate here, because despite our political differences, shouldn't we all agree that all women in the European Union should be able to live a life free from violence? Still, there is opposition to this convention. There are politicians who are spreading lies in order to block the ratification of this very important convention. And these politicians, they only have one precondition under which they actually care about violence against women, and that is when the perpetrator is a Muslim, when the perpetrator is a refugee, when the perpetrator is a stranger, when the perpetrator is somebody who they can politically instrumentalise. And I say to you today, stop these disgusting political campaigns. Start doing something for the protection of women against violence. Start campaigning for the Istanbul Convention, because this is the real political tool that you should use in order to prevent violence from happening. Stand up for women in Europe. Support the Istanbul Convention now.
Bardzo dziękuję pani Reintke.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Reintke. I shall now give the floor to Mrs. Bjork for the GUI NGL group.
Gender-based violence kills. It restricts people's living space. Violence in close relationships. The people who are exposed to these kind of things are women and girls, but also people with a non-standard gender identity or sexuality. And I think it's very important to remember who carries out this violence. It's men. our current form of masculinity, unfortunately, in the worst cases, can lead to gender-based violence. But it doesn't have to be that way. The idea of masculinity is something that can change, and that is where feminism and gender politics can help. We need more feminist men who distance themselves from this kind of behaviour. We're now currently following the work on ratifying the Istanbul Convention, and we know what an important tool it is, legally and politically. We will not give in because this struggle is not over yet. It won't be over until everybody is protected against violence against girls and women. It's a human right. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję. W imieniu grupy
Thank you very much. On behalf of the EFDD group now, Mrs. Daniela Aiuto has the floor.
Thank you, President. A year has now gone by since the signing of the Istanbul Convention by the European Union, and we are now casting our minds back. And it's time, a year down the road, to look back and see how far we've come in the light of our expectations. Are we there yet? No, we're not. Of course, we know that a signature is not going to change things. It doesn't stop violence, it doesn't stop discrimination, which women across Europe suffer every single day. We have to keep up pressure on the member state governments to do more, to legislate effectively and to deploy all the necessary resources and efforts so that the war against violence on women can be brought to an end. Thank you very much, and we will not relent.
Dziękuję bardzo. W imieniu grupy
Thank you very much. Mrs. Trosinski, on behalf of the ENF group now. Thank you very much. A year ago, the European Union signed the Istanbul Convention, and by great demagoguery, you got this text past a majority of members. The time has now come to take stock. Let us look at the women and girls who are the subject of violence. And the European Youth event a few days ago, you had trundled out here women talking about the merits of headscarves. But what's the point of imposing this ideology of gender on women and girls? That will simply make women's rights be eroded. By imposing this ideology on the societies of Europe at a time when the Bulgarian, Hungarian and other governments exercise their sovereignty by refusing to adhere to this little red book of gender, they are publicly pilloried. This is distracting attention from the true dangers facing women and girls in Europe today. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Zamknęliśmy wystąpienia w imieniu.
Thank you. That's all of the speakers on behalf of individual groups. Now, speakers on their own behalf, starting with Mrs. Agnieszka Kozłowska-Rajewicz. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. I wanted to start by reminding you that the Polish government had signed this convention in 2012. It ratified it in 2015. I very much recognized the efforts of this European Parliament. We have been following this very closely, and apart from Russia and Azerbaijan, all of the countries of the Council of Europe have signed up, all of the countries of the European Union, and most countries have ratified it as well, Croatia being a recent example. The Istanbul Convention sets the standard in preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence. The Convention says that nothing can justify violence. In some states, then this should, well, in many countries, all of these acts should be fully criminalized, and the European Union has ratified the Convention. I would call upon the Parliament and the Council to prepare a directive against violence, which should have binding legal power.
Akceptujemy
Thank you very much. We said that we would take no blue cards, distinguished members. I'm sorry, no blue cards. That gives more time for Catch the Eye. The next speaker is Mrs. Arachi Garcia Perez. You have the floor. Thank you, President. 1 in 3 women in the EU has been the victim of some kind of violence. And that's why having this debate here today, when a year ago the institutions of the European Union signed the Istanbul Convention, sends, I think, a very powerful signal about the need to go on being committed and to go on struggling and combating violence exercised against women. I'd like to thank Mr. Timmermans for the highly committed speech he made. It is the case that we need a lot of voices, a lot of support around this issue, and I have to say that I was surprised to hear what the President said on these issues at a time when Bulgaria is one of those countries that has not yet taken on board the need to ratify the Istanbul Convention. It's a moral obligation incumbent upon all member states of the European Union to combat violence against women, because we need legislative measures that will commit us to that, and we need to set up every measure, every step we can to do away with the greatest scourge facing societies in the world today. Women are being murdered simply for being women, and this is not something that anybody can be passive about. Let us shoulder our obligations, shoulder our commitments, and set up this struggle that needs to begin as of now on the basis of unity among all Democrats and everybody who believes that we need a more equal form of Europe. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Mr. Skripek on behalf of the ECR Group.
Vážení kolegovia a kolegyne, vážený pán komisár.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, of course, no one wishes to support violence against women, clearly. But we have got to look at the many things in the text. Individual member states have got real problems, and we have got to respect that difficulty. Violence against women, I think, is not properly described and characterised in this document. It's not that it's violence against women because they're women. Alcohol is very often involved. There are other factors which are involved in point C. For example, it talks about understanding and redefining the role of men and women in society. But that's not something which you can do by international conventions. It's something which is done by education within the family. Women are able to assert themselves in that particular context. And you have situations of rape, and there are difficulties in law because people can be exonerated. There are other ways of pushing this case. Thank you.
Bardzo proszę, pani Becerra.
Thank you. I'll now give the floor to Mrs. Becerra Basterreccia. You have the floor. Thank you, President. Thank you, Vice President. I would like this anniversary of the signing of the Istanbul Convention to be grounds for celebration, but it's unfortunately something we have to speak out against. In March, the Bulgarian government revoked its decision to present the convention for ratification to Parliament, and in February, the Slovakian Prime Minister said that they would refuse to ratify it. According to Mr. Orban, the best way of defending women is to prevent immigration into Hungary. 11 member states have not yet ratified the convention. Some have been threatening for years to reverse their ratification, such as Poland, and there are even countries such as Spain that have ratified but have not yet adequately incorporated provisions in international legislation. The Istanbul Convention is the most exhaustive legal instrument we have to combat gender violence, family violence, violence against women and girls. I hope that the Austrian presidency will complete the commitment that was begun a year ago. Thank you.
Dziękuję uprzejmie. Następnym mówcą jest pani.
Thank you very much. Kostadinka Koneva is the next speaker.
Thank you, President. 1 year on from the signing of the Istanbul Convention by the European Union. A year has gone by and we have not done what is self-evident. We have not applied the principles and the provisions of the Convention in all Member States. And yet the Commission simply does not, it looks the other way here. When EU law is being infringed, the Commission really should intervene. And we're talking here about human rights, which are the basis which underpin our society. And we see fake news being disseminated about the contents of the Convention in a way which is designed to turn people against this. And I want to ask the Commission, what measures does it intend to take to make sure that the Convention which has been signed up to is now enforced? Secondly, how is the Commission going to combat the fake news which has surrounded the Istanbul Convention? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kuneva. The next speaker is Mr. Moyton. Ladies and gentlemen, and members of the other 60 artificial genders out there. Well, okay, we're talking about 1 year of the Istanbul Convention. All EU member states have got effective national laws and procedures to prevent violence against women and men. Otherwise, they would never have become members of the EU or the Council of Europe. That's why the Istanbul Convention is entirely superfluous. It's a politically correct excuse for further deepening absurd gender ideologies and nothing else. The Istanbul Convention rightly is distrusted and rejected. That's why the Council of Europe is even considering spending loads of money on printing nice brochures to try and make this sound nice. The Istanbul Convention is the wrong instrument in the hands of the wrong people. For the minute, we are absolutely against any gender-based violence against women or against men, but it's a question for national criminal law, not a superfluous gender convention. Commissioner Timmermans, please don't deal with gender-based violence in the EU. You are important in actually promoting violence against gender because you are importing people from cultures that do not respect the rights of women from different cultures through your immigration policy. This is absolute hypocrisy, Commissioner, and you can't simply make excuses through this.
Franz Obermeier.
Franz Obermeier.
Thank you, President. It's a pity that in certain member states the Istanbul Convention has not yet been ratified. But of course, ratification does not automatically bring protection of women. Commissioner Timmermans, look at Turkey, where every other woman suffers from domestic violence. And in Turkey, women are being murdered in honour crimes. And this has to do with Islam. And this has to do with President Erdogan. And early this year, the court were talking about the situation of children under these principles. It seems to me that when it comes to education and training, that is important. We've talked about what religion allows violence against women. Condemning violence against women is right, but it must be combated in a preventive way. That's even more important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that concludes the main part of the debate. Now we move on to Catch the Eye. I've only got 26 people on the list for Catch the Eye. I'm afraid I can't let everyone speak. But I hope to allow as many as possible to get a chance to take the floor. Mrs. McGuinness.
Thank you, President. I just want to say very clearly that if you ever have listened to a victim of domestic violence recalling their experience, you would have no doubt of the importance of this issue. And the tragedy is that in our so-called developed world, domestic violence is everywhere, and it is a frightening reality for women and indeed their children. My country, Ireland, has signed the Istanbul Convention but has not ratified it yet, and that needs to be done, and I support the call made here in this debate on this very sensitive issue. And it is a shocking sight and a shocking reality. I listened very recently to a woman describe the circumstances of her experience and how difficult it was for her to extract herself from that. This House can only and absolutely support this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Kenichi.
Grazie.
Yes, thank you very much, President. The signature by the European Union of the Istanbul Convention was a major step forward to provide legal instruments to prevent violence, to combat violence and prosecute the perpetrators and to support the victims. But I have been sad to note that not all countries have ratified the convention, nor the measures to be taken under it. So I think that violence is going to remain a sad feature of women's lives. This isn't enough to resolve so many of the problems linked to gender violence. We need further, more effective measures. We need preventative measures, educational measures that can create a new culture based on respect of women. We also need adoption at the European level of an integrated policy against all forms of violence against women. We should call it zero tolerance across all countries to move towards a truly equal society. Thank you.
Thank you
very much. Mr. Notis Marias.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have had many debates in this House on the Istanbul Convention, and of course it's important that it has been signed. And cases of violence against women are a daily thing, and we must do what we can to put an end to that. There is a social dimension to what is happening as well. Violence, drugs, alcohol are factors, and the phenomenon of domestic violence within families is getting worse every day because of the economic crisis. So the convention is one thing, but it still has to be ratified by all member states. And Bulgaria, being the President in Council, itself has not ratified. And the convention must be ratified, it must be implemented, and robust measures must be taken against those who perpetrate violence against women. Thank you very much.
Teraz bardzo proszę o zabranie głosu pan Ivan Jakovčić.
Mr. Jakovčić.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to draw a parallel. It may look extreme, but I think it is true. Those who do not want to ratify the Istanbul Convention, they want to return us to the Middle Ages. They still think that the earth is flat. They think that women should be burned at the stake. What we are talking here today is unbelievable. In this European Union, we still have countries and politicians in power who do not want to ratify the Istanbul Convention. Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro have ratified the Istanbul Convention. The Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary and some other countries and some countries that want to withdraw the ratification are the witches of Europe today. Hvala lijepa.
Mr. Panayotis.
Mr. Silikiotis. Thank you, President. This is a day on from the signing of the Istanbul Convention. Unfortunately, the phenomenon of violence against women continues to become more acute, and it's taking on different forms. Takes on the form of sexual, psychological violence, mutilation, and many other forms. And there are other forms of oppression which take place. We are seeing an erosion of the protections and in the social economies that we are having, which affect everyone. And I think that we need drastic measures to be taken by the European Union and the Member States. We cannot have we cannot have approximations, and the GUE group will fight to make sure that society is freed of violence against women, against everyone. Thank you.
Pan Florent Marcellesi.
Mr. Marcellesi.
Gracias, presidente. En España, gracias al movimiento.
Thank you, President. In Spain, thanks to the feminist movement, we not only have the government with the maximum rate of women in history, but we also have a situation where combating violence against women is a high priority, and that's why I'm glad that the EU signed the convention a year ago. But I'm so sorry that ratification is continuing to be a problem. And we face so many attacks. I would ask Council and Commission, what are you doing to free the situation up? What do you intend to do to combat these campaigns of disinformation? Do you have any initiatives on the table? We demand that the ratification process shall be concluded with success, but we want more. This Parliament has stated that the Convention is a step in the right direction, but it's not sufficient to put an end to violence against women. We need a directive against gender violence. Don't lose sight of that. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan Csaba Sobor, bardzo proszę.
Thank you very much. Mr. Csaba Sogor.
It is of great significance that 1 year ago the Council has approved the signature of the Istanbul Convention. But can we really celebrate today in terms of facts and figures? Violence against women is an extremely serious crime and a serious breach of human rights. Still, it is a persistent issue in the Member States. The numbers are alarming, as every third woman has been a victim of physical or sexual violence in the EU. In Romania, there have been more than 20,000 reported cases in 2017, but we know that the majority of incidents do not even come to the attention of the police. There is still a long way to go until real practices follow ratification acts and the different forms of gender-based violence diminish in our societies. The Istanbul Convention is not only about numbers, but also about changing current attitudes in our households, as well as shaping the future behaviour of the next generation. Member States can no longer tolerate abusive behaviours towards women and need to join forces to implement action that combats such violence. Thanks.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pani Vilja Blinkevičiūtė.
Thank you, Chair. Colleagues, let's look at the reality into the eye. Thousands of women and girls in the EU member states experience violence, economic, psychological and physical and sexual violence. Every third woman, according to the statistics. If we look deeper, it will be probably thousands of women who are even afraid of reporting about the violence, which means that the reality is even more fearful here in the EU. That's why we have to take all possible measures immediately in order to change the situation so that the women and girls are not abused. I address the presidency, Bulgarian presidency. You are the president and you have to show an example and ratify the Istanbul Convention immediately. Mr. Timmermans, and I would also like to address the Commission to analyze the directive in relation to violence. Otherwise, we will not be able to change the situation. Thank you.
Przewodniczący, panie i panowie posłowie, konwencja stambulska to nie...
Thank you very much. The Istanbul Convention is not a convention that's just about violence. It's a question of gender ideology. The Convention ignores the main causes for violence against women. I'm thinking about the pansexualism of our culture. Look at the sort of things that are going on the internet. Look at the crisis of the family. Violence often takes place where children do not live with their natural parents. Look at the problem of forced marriage. In many of these cases, the marriages take place in countries that have ratified the Convention. Vice President Timmermans, you're ignoring the competences of the European Commission under Article 17. This is supposed to be just coordination, but instead you're going over the heads of member states who do not want to sign up to ideology.
Gracias, presidente. En este aniversario.
Thank you, President. On this anniversary, I wish to say this. No member state of the EU can refuse to ratify the Istanbul Convention, at least if they believe in the values that bring us together, at least if they want to apply the principles of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So the question is, can a state which refuses to ratify the Convention belong to the EU? Certainly no state that wishes to become a member can do so without ratifying this convention. Gender violence is one of the biggest problems facing us, and the Istanbul Convention is the way to bring about solutions. These are crimes that bring about more deaths and casualties each year than terrorism does. If we were to have a minute of silence here for every victim of gender violence over the last 5 years, we'd have to spend 5 days here silent. This is shameful, and those who refuse to seek solutions to this problem should be ashamed of themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much. The scale of violence against women probably will never have received so much media attention as it does now. We need instruments for combating violence against women, and the Convention of Istanbul is probably the most far-reaching instrument we have. Unfortunately, there seem to be no signs of the trend of violence against women turning around. The policies of cutbacks to welfare states, the rise of the right across the European Union, the increase in labour exploitation, the divide between rich and poor, these are all leading to more violence against women. It's impossible to dissociate violence from the socio-economic system. It's not enough to have laws and policies to change this around. What we need is a different approach to society. In Portugal, what you see is people simply trying to ignore phenomena like prostitution. They're talking about freedom of choice, and we really do not accept these efforts to normalise this. Thank you.
Anna Miranda, bardzo proszę.
Anna Miranda.
Obrigada, presidente.
Thank you, President. This is an important instrument against violence against women and against patriarchal and machoist violence. This is the first international instrument which covers all forms of violence against all women of all ages. In times of war and times of peace, around 9 million women in Europe have been raped before they were 15 years old. This is an alarming figure, and it's alarming that people don't deal with this crime as seriously as they should. Women need to look backwards and look forwards. We want to respect at home and at work and in life. We want our daughters to be able to live without fear. There are economic means, because there's economic violence too, and that's why I'm saying zero tolerance against violence, and zero tolerance against member states that have not ratified the Istanbul Convention, and zero tolerance against those machoist members of this parliament who are here, who are machoist, and unfortunately there are many of them. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pani Michaela Šojdrová.
Thank you, Mrs. Šojdrová.
Thank you for the floor, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, from what the Commission has said and from many of you indeed have said, it follows that if we do not ratify this convention against violence against women, then we lack any tools whatsoever. We lack a legal basis to fight violence against women. And I would like to stand up to this untruth, because we do have the European Convention on Human Rights, which clearly states that it fights against torture, inhumane treatment, that it protects dignified life, and it defends the respect of your private and working lives. Citizens ask me, what will happen if we do not ratify the Istanbul Convention? And I tell them, nothing will happen in the Czech Republic. The Istanbul Convention brings nothing new. The Czech Republic does have a law against domestic violence. We've had it since 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, I do understand that this may be very important in certain member states, and I respect this opinion. But please, I ask you, do respect the subsidiarity and decision-making of others. Thank you.
Mulțumesc, domnule președinte, domnule comisar, stimați colegi.
Mrs. Grappini. Now, Commissioner, colleagues, I hope that all of those who are still in the room and those who have already left it agree with signing up to the convention as a first step. Ratification by the member states would be a second step. But now we need to go further. We need to carry out proper prevention work. I am surprised that some colleagues here are against it, because violence does not know any borders. Violence is violence. We need to combat it by all means available. Penalties need to be very harsh on those who dare to use violence against girls and women. We have to combat forced marriage and other kinds of violence as well. We have to pursue this process. But today, 1 year on from the signature of the convention, we need to do more education work against violence. Thank you. Well, let's now conclude this debate. I'd like to apologise to all of those who were not able to take the floor and to catch the eye, but unfortunately our time has run out. Mr. Timmermans, you have the floor.
Allow me to reflect very briefly on the nature of violence against women. Violence against women, sexual violence against women, is about power. It's not about sex. Violence against women is an instrument of submission of women. And those who belittle violence against women believe in a society where women are under submission. And what I find mind-boggling of the extreme right is that they would, at the same time, attack the Istanbul Convention and at the same time say that we should be doing more in attacking violence against women in the Islamic community. If you are serious about that, then the Istanbul Convention will give you additional instruments to do that. I believe that if you oppose the Istanbul Convention with such force, it is based on an ideology that says that submission of women is part of our traditional values. And I refute that vision of our society. The Istanbul Convention, at the end of the day, is about equality between men and women, and to make clear that using violence simply because you are stronger and because you can to create the submission of women is unacceptable in a European society based on our common values, which demand equality of men and women.
Dziękuję bardzo, panie wiceprzewodniczący Komisji.
Thank you very much, Vice President Timmermans. I will now give the floor on behalf of the Council to Mrs. Panayotova.
Honourable members, I have to justify that I am here today in the capacity of the Presidency of the Council, representing all EU member states, so therefore I am not in a position to enter into details about the current situation in Bulgaria. Nevertheless, I would like to underline that it is beyond any doubt that the Bulgarian society is firmly opposed to any form of violence against women. As I had the opportunity to underline during the plenary debate on stalking crimes on the 2nd of May, the fact that the Convention law was included as a priority in the programme of our presidency, it is a clear demonstration that the Bulgarian government is convinced in its importance. The process of ratification of the Convention by the Member States requires respect of the procedures according to the specific national public debates and constitutional arrangements. So we are currently still waiting for clarifications from the Constitutional Court concerning certain aspects of the Convention in relation to the Bulgarian Constitution, and I am convinced that this will contribute to a better informed public debate on the topic. We will assess the situation in the light of the Court's ruling once it is available. As a presidency, I would like to underline that we are fulfilling our duties, investing our utmost efforts to achieve progress, and we will continue to work in a close cooperation with our Austrian colleagues to finalise the discussions on the Code of Conduct towards conclusion by the European Union. I would like to conclude by stressing that we share the view that violence against women and young girls and the protection of its victims is an issue of common concern that touches upon the core values of the European Union. It requires to be addressed with a high level of commitment both by the European institutions and bodies and also by our member states. Thank you for your attention.
Dziękuję bardzo, pani.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Panayotova. And thank you for all of those who have spoken. I would also like to now close that debate, and I will just